we salute those who died for us over a picture of two leading members of the British elite, which is a fair summary, I think, of the essential nature of the First World War, that 15 million people were slaughtered in a war in the interests of the bankers, the corporations, and the rich. And not just that war, because we are marking this evening the centenary of the beginning of the First World War, but also the centenary of the beginning of a century of war. A century in which more than 150 million people have died. A century of industrialized slaughter in the interests of the rich. A century of slaughter for empire and profit, because that is what the First World War was, and that is what so many of the wars since have been about. The bombs raining down on Gaza at the moment are part of the same system that produced the First World War. The bombs raining down are supplied by American arms manufacturers and British arms manufacturers and French arms manufacturers, and the word for that is imperialism. And the reason they arm and fund Israel is because Israel does their bidding in the Middle East, because Israel is the militarized watchdog of Western interests in the Middle East. And that creates a connection with the First World War, because the First World War created the Middle East of today. The same Western imperial powers that are intervening in the Middle East today created the Middle East in a great conflagration between 1916 and 1921. The Middle East is a good place to start if you want to give the answer to those who say, and there are many of them, politicians, journalists, and right-wing historians, many of them who want to say that the First World War was a war for democracy and a war against German expansionism, German imperialism. Look to the Middle East, because in the Middle East they carved out the Arabs who had fought alongside them in bringing down the Ottoman Empire, and Britain grabbed Palestine, Jordan and Iraq, and the French grabbed Syria. The British Empire, the biggest empire in the world in 1914, was even bigger in 1918 as they carved up the world in their interests in a victor's peace. Let's remind ourselves, when they want to argue that the First World War was a war against German imperialism, that Britain had the biggest empire in 1914. Britain had the biggest fleet in 1914. It was Britain, not Germany, that ruled over 400 black and brown people in Asia and Africa under the cosh of the police. Britain was the biggest imperial power at the time. That's the argument we need to put, and we need to remind ourselves as well that when it ended, it didn't much matter, assuming you survived, it didn't much matter whether you were German or British, because the British boys who came back also went back to the unemployment and the slums and the poverty of the interwar period. And if they didn't know it before, if they'd been gulled by the lies of their own rulers during the conflict, they discovered it afterwards, that it had been a war for the rich, a war for the banks, a war for the corporations, and not a war for ordinary working people, and they had never had any interest in fighting German workers in uniform. And I should just say, I'm delighted that today we have both a German historian and a Turkish musician with us, representing countries that were on the other side in the First World War, because we want to ensure that the next century is not another century of war in the way that the century just ending was a century of war, and that depends on building mass movements against war, mass movements against the global system that creates war, in order to ensure that the 21st century becomes a century of internationalism, of cooperation, of solidarity and peace, and not another disaster like the century just passing.